It wasn't a public speech or a leaked headline that set this chain reaction in motion. It was a private document, quietly placed on King Charles's desk, that stopped him cold. For years, money had moved without question, signatures had been automatic, and trust had gone unquestioned. But what Charles discovered in that moment didn't just challenge procedure, it shattered personal loyalty and forced a decision that would send shockwaves through the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What began as another routine financial review was supposed to be uneventful, almost ceremonial in its predictability. These briefings were designed to reassure, not disturb, to confirm that everything within the royal machine continued to run smoothly. King Charles had long relied on these moments as quiet checkpoints, a way to maintain order without micromanagement. Camilla had been granted broad discretion over certain financial streams, a trust rooted not just in protocol, but in personal confidence, built over years of shared battles and private understandings. That trust had never felt risky until now. The shift was subtle at first, a pause that lingered a second too long, a page that was turned back instead of forward. Figures that didn't immediately make sense, buried deep within columns meant to be skimmed rather than studied. Advisors noticed it instantly. The room changed when Charles stopped speaking. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with focus. This was the look of a man realizing that something familiar had quietly slipped out of alignment. Numbers were reread, margins were checked, silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, as calculations were silently repeated. What unsettled Charles most wasn't the size of the discrepancies, but their placement. These weren't bold errors or reckless overages. They were precise, strategically hidden, designed to pass through unquestioned, because they always had. Each irregular figure alone could be explained away, dismissed as administrative nuance. Together they formed something far more troubling. A pattern. One that suggested intention rather than accident. One that hinted at movement rather than miscalculation. Advisors exchanged glances without speaking. No one wanted to be the first to say what was becoming obvious. This wasn't a single oversight. It was repetition, consistency, a rhythm that suggested planning. Charles felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Trust, once given, is hard to withdraw but harder still to defend when evidence begins to stack quietly against it. He realized, in that moment, that the system he had relied on to protect harmony may have also protected secrecy. The pages were gathered again, this time not as paperwork, but as proof. Each line seemed to carry more meaning than before, each figure echoing the same unspoken warning. Whatever this was, it had been allowed to grow, because no one had questioned it soon enough. And now, questioning it meant accepting that something fundamental had gone unnoticed under his watch. The monarchy thrives on continuity, but continuity without scrutiny can quietly turn into vulnerability. As the gravity of the discovery began to sink in, one question loomed larger than all the rest: where exactly was the money going? Royal finances are designed to be complex, layered, and quietly controlled but not invisible. Somewhere within that maze, a financial pipeline had been operating just outside the spotlight. It wasn't illegal on paper. It wasn't loud. But it was intentional. And once the trail was followed far enough, it became clear this money wasn't serving the crown, it was feeding something else entirely. With the first section of doubt now firmly lodged, the focus shifted from shock to structure. The system itself demanded attention. Royal funds had always moved through carefully designed channels, built to protect discretion and preserve continuity. Allocations were approved with language broad enough to allow flexibility, a necessary compromise in an institution where needs change quietly and quickly. But that same flexibility had become a blind spot. Money meant for general support was being redirected with ease, slipping through classifications that sounded harmless, even reassuring to anyone not looking closely. As advisors mapped the flow, secondary accounts began to surface, accounts that existed comfortably in the background, masked by labels that suggested routine support rather than targeted purpose. These weren't rogue creations. They had been formally established, approved, and quietly maintained. Their existence alone wasn't alarming. What unsettled everyone was how consistently they were used, absorbing funds at predictable intervals, growing steadily while remaining just obscure enough to avoid attention. It felt less like an accident and more like infrastructure. The deeper the examination went, the more the pattern revealed itself. Transfers repeated with an almost mechanical precision, moving toward destinations that sat outside the usual orbit of the Crown's responsibilities. Each transaction was small enough to avoid scrutiny on its own, yet together they formed a clear trajectory. Advisors found themselves circling the same names, the same conduits, the same endpoints. Familiar faces appeared in unfamiliar roles, positioned as intermediaries whose presence softened accountability while maintaining absolute control. What became impossible to ignore was how deliberately these intermediaries had been used. They weren't random buffers. They were trusted, strategically placed, and insulated by proximity rather than visibility. Direct scrutiny was avoided not through secrecy but through distance. The source stayed clean, the destination stayed protected, and the path between them remained comfortably blurred. It was a system designed to operate indefinitely, fueled by the assumption that trust would never be challenged. Then came the uncomfortable echoes from the past. As files were revisited, advisors uncovered early warnings that had once flickered briefly before being extinguished. Questions raised and quietly answered. Concerns reframed as misunderstandings. Each dismissal had been justified at the time, wrapped in the belief that loyalty outweighed suspicion. Those moments now read like missed chances, points where intervention could have occurred, where the trail might have been interrupted before it grew so entrenched. By the time the review reached its end, the most disturbing detail was not the destination of the money, but its consistency. This wasn't a deviation. It was a system running exactly as intended. The realization settled heavily. The pipeline hadn't survived despite oversight, it had thrived because of it. And with that understanding came a new, far more dangerous uncertainty. But tracing the money only raised a more dangerous question: who else knew? And how long had this been happening? The money didn't vanish into thin air. It moved through people-trusted faces, loyal allies, and quiet operators who existed just beyond official titles. As King Charles's team peeled back the layers, a familiar pattern emerged. An inner circle that answered to Camilla first, the monarchy second. And suddenly, the issue was no longer financial, it was personal. Once names began to surface, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted again. These weren't strangers or distant consultants. They were individuals who had moved comfortably through royal corridors for years, welcomed by familiarity rather than questioned by authority. Their names appeared again and again, linked to transfers that now felt impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Each connection tightened the sense that this was not an abstract system, but a living network, one that relied on relationships, loyalty, and silence to survive. At the center of that network were unofficial advisors, figures who operated without formal appointments yet wielded quiet influence. They didn't appear on public records or ceremonial schedules, but they were present where decisions were shaped and intentions clarified. Their power came from access, not rank, from trust, not transparency. These advisors facilitated initiatives framed as personal priorities rather than institutional responsibilities, allowing money to move without ever passing through the king's direct line of sight. As the trail expanded, it became clear that several private causes and initiatives had been funded without ever being cleared through official royal channels. These weren't rogue charities or reckless indulgences. They were carefully chosen projects aligned with Camilla's personal vision, supported by a structure that bypassed traditional oversight. To those inside the circle, it likely felt justified, even necessary. To Charles, it felt like a parallel operation, one that existed beside the crown, not beneath it. The emotional tension was impossible to ignore. King Charles had spent years balancing authority with accommodation, believing that harmony within the household strengthened the institution itself. Camilla's autonomy had been part of that balance, respected as independence rather than viewed as defiance. Now, that same independence looked dangerously close to separation. The question was no longer about where the money went, but who had decided it could go there at all. Staff felt the strain immediately. Loyalties that once felt clear became complicated. Some feared exposure, realizing their proximity to the network could place them in jeopardy. Others doubled down on silence, believing discretion was still the safest currency in royal life. Conversations grew guarded. Trust thinned. Every whispered exchange carried the weight of uncertainty, as if everyone sensed that something long contained was finally pressing against the surface. The most unsettling realization came quietly. This network hadn't relied on the king's approval because it hadn't needed it. It functioned independently, sustained by habit and confidence, operating under the assumption that its existence would never be fully examined. Authority had been assumed, not granted, and once that truth settled in, it became impossible to pretend this was merely a financial anomaly. What began as a financial concern was now evolving into a confrontation that Charles could no longer postpone. No cameras, no witnesses, just a closed door and a conversation that would redefine trust inside the palace. When King Charles finally confronted Camilla, it wasn't with accusations but with proof. Line by line, transfer by transfer. What followed wasn't denial. It was something far more complicated and far more damaging. The setting was deliberate, chosen not for comfort but for finality. This was not a meeting meant to be interrupted or softened by ceremony. It was private, controlled, and stripped of pretense. Charles did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of what he carried into the room spoke for him. Papers were placed carefully, almost respectfully, as if acknowledging that what they contained could not be undone. Each document represented not just money, but moments where trust had quietly been tested and lost. As he spoke, Charles remained measured, even restrained. He walked through the evidence without embellishment, allowing the facts to stand on their own. Transfers, accounts, names. There was no need for dramatics. The calmness in his tone made the impact sharper, not softer. Camilla listened without interrupting at first, her composure intact, her posture steady. She had weathered scrutiny before. This felt, at least initially, like another challenge she could navigate. But composure has limits. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. When the explanations began, they were framed not as confessions, but as necessities. Decisions made, she suggested, to protect interests that could not always survive official channels. Choices justified by experience, by the belief that certain things required discretion beyond rigid structures. It wasn't wrongdoing, she implied. It was management, adaptation, survival. Beneath those words, however, ran a current of resentment, a sense that her autonomy had long been misunderstood, that her contributions were scrutinized only when they became inconvenient. Independence had been her shield, and now it felt threatened. The conversation drifted from facts into feeling, from documentation into history. Old compromises resurfaced. Unspoken frustrations found their way into carefully chosen phrases. This was no longer just about money, it was about control, recognition, and the cost of always operating in someone else's shadow. Charles listened, absorbing not just the explanations but the emotion behind them. And when the justifications finally ran thin, when even necessity could no longer account for the scope of what had been revealed, the room fell silent. Not an angry silence, a hollow one. The kind that arrives when all reasonable defenses have been exhausted and nothing remains to say. In that quiet, the truth settled heavily between them. Whatever intentions had once existed, the result was a breach that could not be ignored. No resolution came in that moment. No dramatic declaration, just an understanding, shared and unspoken, that something fundamental had changed. The balance they had maintained for years had shifted, and neither could pretend otherwise. The conversation ended not with agreement, but with distance, emotional, deliberate, and deeply consequential. By the time the conversation ended, Charles knew one thing for certain: doing nothing was no longer an option. Stopping the payments wasn't just a financial move, it was a declaration. In a system built on tradition and quiet compromise, King Charles chose disruption. With a single instruction, funds that had flowed freely for years were frozen. And inside palace walls, everyone understood what that truly signaled. A line had finally been drawn. The decision was executed with precision, not spectacle. There were no sweeping announcements or dramatic ultimatums, just a tightly worded directive routed through the most trusted channels. Authorizations were paused. Automatic renewals were halted. What had once moved by habit now required scrutiny. Charles insisted on clarity where there had long been assumption, and the machinery of royal finance felt the jolt immediately. It was a controlled intervention, but its impact rippled far beyond balance sheets. Advisors moved quickly to caution him. They spoke of precedent and perception, of how sudden disruption could be interpreted as instability. They warned of political fallout, of whispers that could grow louder if the action was misunderstood. Charles listened, as he always did. But this time listening did not mean yielding. He understood the risks. He also understood the cost of restraint. Allowing the payments to continue would have signaled approval by default. And that, to him, felt like a greater danger. The symbolic weight of the decision settled heavily across the palace. Cutting financial access in this way was rare, almost unheard of, especially at this level. It wasn't punishment, not officially. It was correction. Yet symbols matter in monarchies, and this symbol spoke clearly. Authority was being reasserted. Lines of responsibility were being redrawn. And discretion, once taken for granted, was now conditional. Reactions were immediate, if carefully contained. Staff members who had grown accustomed to predictable flows felt the ground shift beneath them. Some scrambled to understand the implications, others to distance themselves from decisions they had once quietly supported. Conversations lowered in volume but increased in urgency. The atmosphere grew taut, as if everyone sensed that this move was not an ending, but an opening. Camilla's response was measured, but unmistakable. There was no public challenge, no outward display of resistance. Instead, a cool recalibration. The sudden financial blockade forced a reckoning, not just with logistics, but with power. Independence that had once been exercised freely now required negotiation. Silence became strategy. Every choice, every pause, carried meaning. Across the royal hierarchy, the message landed with precision. This was not an isolated correction. It was a reminder. Authority did not drift indefinitely. It could be reclaimed. Those who had assumed continuity without oversight felt exposed, unsure whether their own arrangements might soon face similar scrutiny. The palace had long thrived on quiet understandings, but those understandings now felt fragile, subject to review rather than reverence. And beneath it all lay a deeper unease. Stopping the payments solved nothing on its own. It merely stopped the bleeding. Questions remained unanswered. Relationships strained but unresolved. The machinery had been halted, but the forces that built it were still very much in place, waiting to respond. Yet stopping the money exposed something even more dangerous: the consequences of what would happen next. The palace doesn't erupt at fractures. Quietly, behind smiles and scheduled appearances, tension began to spread. Staff whispered. Alliances shifted. And with every frozen account came a new fear. If this could happen to Camilla, who would be next? The first reaction was panic, carefully disguised as composure. Those who had once operated comfortably within the financial network felt the walls closing in, suddenly aware that proximity now carried risk. Conversations became clipped. Emails were reread before being sent. Long-standing assumptions about protection evaporated overnight. People who had never questioned their roles began questioning their futures, wondering whether their names might already be sitting in someone else's folder. Loyalists moved fast. Some attempted to shield Camilla by reframing the narrative, insisting the freeze was temporary, procedural, misunderstood. Others focused on protecting themselves, quietly distancing their names from past decisions they had once defended. Reputations, built over decades, suddenly felt fragile. The scramble wasn't loud, but it was relentless, subtle repositioning. Strategic silence. A quiet rewriting of history in real time. Caught in the middle were staff members whose loyalty had always been divided by design. Serving both king and queen consort had once been a point of pride, a symbol of unity at the heart of the monarchy. Now it felt like a liability. Instructions that once flowed smoothly now came with hesitation. Protocols shifted without explanation. Access changed. Meetings were rescheduled or quietly reassigned. No one said why, but everyone understood the message. Trust was being recalibrated. These subtle changes rippled outward. Doors that had always been open were suddenly closed. Familiar routines felt unfamiliar. Even minor adjustments carried emotional weight, as if the palace itself were holding its breath. The strain didn't stay contained behind closed doors either. It bled into public moments, into carefully managed appearances where smiles held just a fraction too long, and silences lingered where warmth once lived. The contrast was striking ceremony on the surface, unease beneath. What unsettled everyone most was the sense that secrets were no longer safe. For years, discretion had been the palace's strongest currency, an unspoken agreement that what happened inside stayed inside. Now that agreement felt conditional. If financial flows could be questioned, then so could decisions once assumed untouchable. The idea that oversight had awakened sent a chill through corridors long accustomed to quiet immunity. Whispers grew sharper, less cautious. Not about the freeze itself, but about what might follow. Who else had benefited from the old system? Who else had assumed permanence? Each unanswered question fed the tension, turning uncertainty into its own kind of threat. The palace wasn't just reacting, it was bracing. And beyond those walls, something else was happening. The shift was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to those who understood power. When an institution shows strain, it attracts attention. When unity falters, it invites scrutiny. The monarchy's internal fracture had created a faint signal, one that traveled farther than anyone intended. As fear spread inside the palace, outside forces began circling, sensing vulnerability. This wasn't just about money. For King Charles, it was about history, his own and the monarchy's. Years of compromise had led here, to a moment where restraint threatened relevance. And as pressure mounted, Charles understood that protecting the crown sometimes meant confronting the people closest to it. For much of his life, Charles had lived in the shadow of continuity. He was shaped by a system that prized patience over urgency, harmony over confrontation. Authority, he had been taught, was something exercised quietly, almost reluctantly. And for years, that philosophy had guided his choices. Difficult moments were softened. Conflicts were managed rather than resolved. He believed unity, even fragile unity, was better than open fracture. But the weight of that restraint had accumulated, pressing harder with each compromise made in the name of peace. History loomed heavily over every decision. The monarchy had survived scandals before, but not without cost. Charles carried the memory of those moments, times when hesitation allowed doubt to grow, when silence was mistaken for indifference. Public trust, once lost, was painfully slow to rebuild. And now, faced with another internal reckoning, he felt the familiar tension between preserving calm and asserting control. The fear wasn't just of conflict, but of repeating patterns that had already proven damaging. Advisors sensed the shift in him before it was ever spoken aloud. Their counsel grew firmer, less cautious. They urged decisiveness, reminding him that leadership delayed is often leadership denied. The institution, they argued, needed clarity. Ambiguity only invited speculation, and speculation eroded authority. Charles listened, aware that every delay made his eventual action appear more reactive than resolute. The longer he waited, the more the narrative threatened to escape his control. Yet beneath strategy lay something far more personal. Choosing duty over relationship carried an emotional cost that no briefing could soften. The bonds forged over years of shared endurance did not dissolve easily. Loyalty had been given, trust extended, sacrifices made quietly and often without acknowledgement. To challenge that bond felt like betrayal, even when justified. Charles wrestled with the knowledge that asserting authority might preserve the crown while irrevocably altering the relationships that sustained him within it. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once. Inaction, once framed as patience, now risked being seen as weakness. Not just by the public, but within the palace itself. Authority unexercised invites challenge. Silence creates space for others to act unchecked. Charles understood that the role he now occupied demanded more than careful balance, it demanded clarity. The crown could not afford ambiguity at its center. This reckoning reshaped his understanding of leadership. Protecting the monarchy did not always mean shielding it from discomfort. Sometimes it meant allowing that discomfort to surface, trusting that resilience came not from avoidance, but from confrontation. The decision he had already made to stop the money was only the beginning. It marked a departure from restraint, a signal that continuity would no longer excuse complacency. But even this decision carried a risk, one that could reshape the monarchy's future. What the public knows is almost nothing, but what remains buried could be far more explosive. Documents exist, names are recorded, and if even part of this financial trail were to surface, the consequences wouldn't stop with Camilla or even Charles. Behind the sealed doors and careful silence, deeper layers still sit untouched. Financial documentation that goes beyond summaries and approvals, beyond surface explanations, detailed records, correspondence, internal notes that trace intent as much as movement. These materials were never meant to be read together, never meant to form a complete picture. But once assembled, they tell a story that is far more difficult to control. One that connects decisions to people, and people to outcomes that were never publicly acknowledged. The greatest threat no longer comes from discovery at the top, but from disillusionment below. Insiders who once believed in discretion as a shared value now feel exposed by it. For those whose loyalty was transactional rather than ideological, silence has begun to feel like a burden instead of protection. All it takes is one voice, one document, one carefully timed disclosure for the narrative to fracture beyond repair. And the monarchy knows this. It has seen before how quickly private matters can become public reckoning. The potential backlash is impossible to fully calculate. Financial impropriety, even when legally defensible, carries symbolic weight in an institution built on moral authority. Public trust is fragile, especially when transparency appears selective. Politically, the implications stretch wider still. Questions would be raised not just about oversight, but about governance, about who holds influence, and how far that influence extends beyond ceremonial roles. Once those questions are asked, they do not easily retreat. Preparation has already begun, quietly and methodically. Contingency plans drafted without names attached. Scenarios discussed in conditional language. If this emerges, then that follows. The monarchy has always been adept at damage control, shaping narratives without appearing to shape them at all. Statements can be prepared. Timelines adjusted. Sacrifices calculated. The goal is not denial, but containment, limiting the blast radius before it reaches the core. At the same time, silent efforts are underway to seal the cracks. Access is reviewed. Information is compartmentalized. Trust is reassessed. Not through grand gestures, but through small, deliberate adjustments designed to slow momentum. The institution leans on its oldest instinct, endurance through silence. Wait it out. Let attention drift. Assume that without confirmation, suspicion will eventually fade. But silence is no longer guaranteed to work. The environment has changed. Stories no longer require official validation to take hold. The longer the truth remains suspended, the more space speculation fills. And speculation, once ignited, is far harder to contain than fact. Every withheld answer sharpens curiosity. Every delayed response feels intentional. The monarchy now stands in a narrow corridor between two risks. Reveal too much, and control is lost. Reveal too little, and credibility erodes. The documents remain where they are for now. The names remain unspoken for now. But time is no longer neutral. It presses forward, indifferent to strategy. Because in the end, one final choice remains: exposure or containment. Every monarchy faces moments that define it, not in ceremony, but in crisis. King Charles' decision to stop the money may never be officially acknowledged, but its impact will echo for years. Trust has shifted, power has been tested, and the crown now stands at a crossroads where every future decision will be measured against this one. What followed was not a clean resolution, but a recalibration of power that unfolded quietly, almost invisibly. Inside the palace, long-standing assumptions were re-examined. Authority, once diffused through habit and deference, began to consolidate. The message was subtle yet unmistakable. Continuity would no longer substitute for accountability. Decisions that once passed through layers of custom now faced the weight of consequence. In redefining the boundaries of financial control, Charles redefined the boundaries of influence itself. Yet this shift came at a cost. The monarchy survives on image as much as institution, and image is fragile. The balance between what must be seen and what must remain hidden grew more precarious with each passing day. Silence protected stability, but it also bred suspicion. Transparency promised relief but threatened exposure. Every option carried risk, and every risk threatened to erode the very authority the crown sought to preserve. The truth hovered close enough to feel dangerous, distant enough to remain deniable. Camilla's position became the quiet variable in an already volatile equation. Without public statements or formal acknowledgments, uncertainty filled the gaps. Her role, once defined by confidence and continuity, now felt unresolved. Allies hesitated. Critics speculated. The absence of clarity spoke louder than any announcement could have. What had once seemed settled now felt provisional, subject to forces still moving beneath the surface. For Charles, this moment marked an evolution that could not be undone. He had stepped into decisiveness not through spectacle, but through restraint sharpened into action. The monarch who once favored patience now carried the weight of consequence openly. Leadership, he realized, was not measured by how long harmony could be preserved, but by how firmly boundaries could be enforced when harmony failed. The crown he protected today would not be the same one he inherited, but perhaps it would be stronger for it. Still, the central dilemma remained unresolved. Secrecy had preserved the institution for generations, yet secrecy had also enabled the very fractures now exposed. Transparency offered renewal, but at a price the monarchy had rarely paid willingly. Each path demanded sacrifice, each demanded courage, and neither guaranteed survival without scars. The institution stood suspended between past and future, tradition and transformation. What lingered most was the sense that this chapter had not closed, it had merely paused. Documents remained sealed, conversations unfinished, loyalties tested but not fully revealed. The decisions already made had set forces in motion that could not be easily reversed. And as history has shown time and again, moments like this do not fade quietly. They wait. They gather meaning. They return when least expected. Because when money stops flowing, secrets, don't they wait? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.